except that's not what she said.
Some people aren't going to like you. I remember thinking like, yeah, I'm definitely not going to stand up in front of an audience and be like, I command you to whatever.
Oh, well, you had to be there. No, I didn't, because that's why we invented stories. So I, in fact, didn't gotta be there.
What's up, rhetoric nerds, and welcome back to another episode of Rhetorically Speaking, a podcast committed to banishing banality one speech at a time. I am, of course, your hostess with the mostess, rhetorical scholar Lee Pierce, professor of rhetoric, hater of cliches, and for those of you who haven't tuned in before, rhetoric, essentially it means studying what we're doing when we use words that maybe we don't know we're doing. And that could be verbal fillers, or it could be perpetuating the white supremacist patriarchy in the metaphors that we choose. I had difficulty coming up with a topic. It's the middle of summer, I'm outside gardening, so I decided I'm going to read to you today an excerpt from a book chapter that I wrote that I'm not going to publish. Originally, the book was called When Black Women Speak, The Politics of White Listening, and now I have created a different trajectory for the book project, so I have a bunch of written pages that are not going to be used, with a couple of cool examples, and so I thought I would read that to you, and a little bit different. I hope you enjoy. It's the summer of 2020. Officer Derek Chauvin has murdered George Floyd, and the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation is at the center of controversy. Founded by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors in 2013, BLM-GNF does not officially represent the social movement called Black Lives Matter, but was instrumental in designing messaging campaigns. In particular, their What We Believe statement became a kind of rhetorical headquarters, influencing everything from curriculum design to a children's activity book. The What We Believe statement sat quietly on their website for years, until talk show host and NFL lineman Marcus Wiley spearheaded a backlash against the statement, claiming it advocated for abolishing the nuclear family structure and erasing black fathers. Except, that's not what they said. In fact, the 36-word passage of What We Believe that drew the ire of Wiley and many others never used the word abolish. It also didn't use any related transitive verbs, such as demolish or destroy. Transitive verbs are verbs that require an object. You must demolish something, destroy something. In fact, the word that the statement used was disrupt. Quote, "We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement." Disrupt is an intransitive verb. It doesn't imply the complete destruction of a target, and it is very different, grammatically and politically, from demolish and destroy. But that distinction didn't seem to matter to BLM opposition like Wiley. Sometime in September 2020, the BLM-GNF website removed its What We Believe statement, replacing it with a shorter and more palatable About Us page. The misreading of a single word may seem like simply the kind of general, lazy, inattentive reading that we all deal with nowadays in an age of constant stimuli and social media. But I suggest differently. The collective misreading of What We Believe in the summer of 2020 is one of so many instances when the speech of black women has been ignored, misheard, or otherwise whitewashed in order to discipline the threat of black women's speech to the smooth operations of white hegemony. I've chosen the word white hegemony here to describe the project as opposed to white privilege or white supremacy, because to me it captures those implicit or systemically ingrained ways that American audiences whitewash the speech of black women. White hegemony is a mediating term between white supremacy and white power, which denote a conscious intention to oppress black Americans, if not re-enslave or massacre them. And white privilege, which denotes this kind of everyday naivete that can be corrected by awareness. White hegemony is not correctable through sheer awareness. It circulates through taken-for-granted assumptions about how language works, cliches that often seem to be beneficial to race relations, and pervasive myths that shore up the oppression of black Americans in ways that often get missed by mainstream audiences. It's the summer of 1998. Lauryn Hill is poised to release what will become one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. During a pre-release interview with MTV, Hill told the reporter, "I would rather die than have a white person buy one of my albums." America is outraged by Hill's hypocrisy and anti-white racism. A caller to the Howard Stern show took the interview viral, repeating other quotes from Hill, including, "If I'd known white people were going to buy my last album, I never would have recorded it," and "I would rather have my children starve than have white people buy my albums." Except that's not what she said. No evidence exists, on MTV or otherwise, that Hill said anything of the sort. In fact, Hill put in a call to the Howard Stern show shortly after the rumors circulated to rebut the supposed citations made by the previous caller. During a subsequent interview on MTV, Hill remarked that, "A couple of years ago, some kid had heard that I'd said that I didn't want white people to buy my records. And that really, really hurt me a great deal, because I like to think my music is really universal." Interesting how just as miseducation was bringing radical black self-love, especially of black women, to mainstream America, in ways that Erykah Badu and Queen Latifah had only been able to do in small doses, its creator was busy apologizing to white people for something she never said. Hill's groundbreaking rhythms and rhymes are exemplary of the radical and disruptive speech of black women that threatens white hegemony so profoundly that it needs to be disciplined through viral miscitation. I describe miseducation as speech because it is a discourse, a collection of single texts that disrupts or complicates norms and conventions of thought and belief. In casual use, speech is a verb that usually means some kind of talking, saying of words. As a noun, a speech is a public address of some kind, whether it's an impromptu rant with a friend or a TED Talk. By those definitions, most of the speech that I explore is not speech. Most people might use the term communication, but communication comes with definitional baggage that misses the point I'm trying to make. Communication is a very new concept, derived from modern social science and proliferating media technologies. When we label things as communication or communicating, we carry along implicit expectations of homogeneity and sameness. Speech, however, is the disruptor of communication, not a manifestation of it. Communication aims for understanding and similarity. Speech aims at radical heterogeneity, right? Radical difference. As opposed to what Ana Milena Ribeiro has called acceptable heterogeneity, such as the inclusion of black and brown people into the U.S. national imaginary, while hiding its promotion of policies and discourses that maintain discrimination. Speech insists that the myth of communication is always a function of white hegemony, of an insistence on erasing racial difference. Speech reinserts that difference into the heart of what it means to say anything. It's the 1st of December, 1955. Soon-to-be civil rights icon Rosa Parks has been asked by her white bus driver whether she is going to obey the law and vacate her seat for an oncoming white passenger. You've likely heard this story. The dignified seamstress, worn out after a long day of work, was simply too tired to fight anymore and respectfully told the driver no. In the decade since, Park has been memorialized as a woman who relaunched a revolution because she was exhausted. When Parks died in 1995, the theme of her memorials, from former U.S. President Bill Clinton to NBC News anchor Brian Williams, ironically both Me Tooers, was quietude and dignity for this elderly woman who exemplified civil disobedience. Except that's not what she said. For years prior to her death, Parks corrected the narrative that she was old and tired on that day on the bus. She wasn't old. She was only 42. And she didn't happen upon a protest, but had long worked as a freedom fighter in the NAACP, specifically chosen on that day to launch the Montgomery boycotts by refusing to give up her seat. Most importantly, Parks reminds readers in her 1992 autobiography, she wasn't tired. "The only tired I was," Parks writes, "was tired of giving in." Yet her story continues to be whitewashed for the version that traps her on the bus and makes her meek, in the words of Jean Theoharis. Quote, "We miss who she was and what it took and what she's asking of us today." Whereas Parks' account of her protest centers speech or disruption, the whitewashed version exemplifies communication with all of its associated values of effectiveness and efficiency, launching an entire revolution in social justice without a single rude word, raised voice, or smashed window, comports perfectly with the white hegemonic dream of a post-racial America that is magically achieved without any disruption or discomfort on the part of those who have wielded power for centuries. Effectiveness and efficiency are the gold standard for what communication should do. Mean what you say, achieve your intended outcome, do so without too much fluff. All of those aims are held up as the best a person can do when they are so-called communicating. We collectively praise efficiency, clarity, conciseness. As I was researching the project, several people recommended that I look at the speech of Stacey Abrams because she's a paragon of clarity and conciseness. Abrams served in the Georgia House of Representatives and was instrumental in flipping Georgia in the 2020 presidential and Senate elections. But given all the work the Black women have done for America, we can do better than praising them for their effectiveness and efficiency as communicators. I certainly don't think it's wrong to do. After all, Abrams herself has said she is a communicator who values clarity. But when we consider the broader context of anti-Black racism in America, efficiency and effectiveness are often held up as justifications. After all, it is precisely in the name of efficiency that so many Black women's bodies have been used, abused, and discarded throughout history. And at this point, I'm going to move on to discuss, not super graphic, but a little bit about experimentation on Black women subjects by gynecologists in the mid-19th century. So just to let people know that that's on the way. It's 1846, then 1847, then 1848, then 1849. A gynecologist named J. Marion Sims is perfecting surgical procedures still used in obstetrics and gynecology to this day. He perfects those techniques on the bodies of enslaved Black women, volunteered by their slavers when they failed to perform the reproductive and capitalist labor that kept them alive and valuable. With the exception of 3 names, Betsy, Lucy, and Anarcha, Sims never recorded the names of the women he violated, nor can we presume that these were their names at all. Yet he insists in his autobiography these enslaved women on whom he experimented, mostly unsuccessfully and entirely without anesthesia, quote, clamored for operations, insisting he keep trying to cure their injuries, end quote. Lewis Wall, a contemporary defender of Sims, contemporary to me, not Sims, sorry, new person, praises Sims' perseverance, explaining that, quote, it is not surprising that these patients, even though they were enslaved, would have jumped at the opportunity to have surgery. Except that's not what they said. As Vanessa Norton Gamble explains, one cannot take recourse to a logic of consent in a system of violence built on the erasure of consent as a capacity of enslaved persons. Quote, even if an enslaved woman stated that she did not want to be operated on, writes Deirdre Cooper Owens, once her owner granted permission to the surgeon to perform surgery, an operation occurred. If Sims's biography is a factual report of what happened, which is itself a big if, the word clamoring could suggest infinite meanings, including the expression of pain in another register. Borrowing from Tara Green, Sims hardly qualifies as a trustworthy translator of experience. The captor cannot so easily interpret the purpose of clamoring. And what of these injuries Sims was meant to cure? One can hardly point to the injury suffered by an enslaved woman. Her life is a series of injuries, most of which are immune to surgical repair. Although contemporary medical criticism denounces Sims' barbarism as a product of its time, overwhelming evidence suggests that Sims' racist logics are embedded in the fabric of modern American medicine. Despite being the growing demographic in terms of political engagement, collective degrees, and so-called upward social mobility, Black women have shown little improvement in their quality of life. Eunice Omega gets right to the point. Quote, Kamala Harris's ascent doesn't mean progress for Black women. Black women continue to suffer disproportionately from high rates of preventable diseases, including obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and heart failure. The data on Black women's health is but one stark indication of the toll that systemic racism continues to have on their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. As Terry M. Williams puts it, it just looks like we're not hurting. I am interested in another indication. Despite being one of the most powerful groups of political and cultural production, the messages of Black women continued to be the most violently whitewashed. Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, Rosa, Lauren, Patrice, Opal, Alicia, Kamala, Amanda, not to mention Sojourner Truth, whose classic speech, Ain't I a Woman, is in fact not called that at all. What Truth said is, I am a women's rights. She was mistranslated in this kind of very southern, uneducated Black vernacular by a white woman after the speech was given. At the core of each of these violations of Black women is the unwillingness of white hegemony to listen. Certainly there are differences. The rape, murder, and torture suffered by the countless unnamed Black women for the sake of, quote, medical advancements that continue to disproportionately benefit anti-Black and non-Black people are not equivalent to the damage done by misreading and quotation. But to me, those are differences in degree, not kind. While they may range in severity, they share in common a fundamental connection between abusing the bodies of Black women and misusing their speech. Without equivocating the assault on Black women's bodies and the attack on their words, there is an intimate connection between how popular discourse ignores, misquotes, or misreads the speech of Black women and the health disparities perpetuated by systemic racism. According to research by social psychologists Amanda Sesko and Monica Burnett, quote, statements said by a Black woman in a group discussion were least likely to be correctly attributed as compared with participants from other demographic groups. And that concludes the reading of this excerpt from this book that will never be published. I hope you learned something. I certainly learned something writing it. And thank you for allowing me to give you something a little different this week while I enjoy the sunshine. I will be back with our next episode of Rhetorically Speaking, coming up some Tuesday soon at a podcast near you. Thank you so much for being an ally in the fight against cliches. Look for new episodes of Rhetorically Speaking dropping every other Tuesday. And help other rhetoric nerds find the show with a shout out on social media, or, good old word of mouth.